Welcome to Park Avenue Plastic Surgery Class, the podcast where we explore controversies and breaking issues in plastic surgery. I'm your co-host, Doreen Wu, a clinical assistant at Bass Plastic Surgery in New York City. I'm excited to be here with Dr. Lawrence Bass, Park Avenue plastic surgeon, educator, and technology innovator. The title of today's episode is Daxxify, the new longer-lasting neuromodulator. Dr. Bass, this is a hot topic. I'm looking forward to hearing all about the details.
We've talked about Botox and other neuromodulators on the podcast before. Daxxify has been a long-awaited entry to the marketplace. Botox remains the most popular aesthetic treatment. One of the improvements most requested by patients is longer durability. Daxxify is a new neuromodulator that has been labeled by FDA for longer duration than Botox. I've asked my close friend and colleague, Dr. Michael Kane, to join us for this episode and to share his perspective on this new development. Dr. Kane is a plastic surgeon in New York City, and he has spent the past 3 decades working extensively with Botox and other neuromodulators with injectable fillers, doing research, lecturing worldwide, and training many in advanced techniques using these technologies. He's the author of the Botox Book, which was published in 2002, and is truly probably the preeminent international authority on this topic. So I'm delighted that he was able to join us, and welcome to the podcast.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for that very kind and generous welcome, Dr. Bass.
So first, we should review the history and the current playing field that Daxxify is entering and trying to disrupt.
Yes, I always look forward to the history lesson we have. It helps me get a better understanding of where we started and how things are changing now. So, Dr. Kane, can you give us a brief overview of how Botox started for aesthetic treatments?
Sure. Well, Botox, actually, its original brand name was botulinum before they changed the name to Botox, and that was approved back in 1988 for ophthalmologic uses. It was approved for a spasm of the muscle around the eye, the muscle that closes the eye, and it was also approved for strabismus, something that lay people often call cross-eyedness. There's basically 6 muscles around each eye within the eye socket that rotate the eye and point it where you want it to point. And with strabismus, that mechanism was a little off, where one muscle was stronger than another was weaker, and the patient didn't have total control over where their eyes went. And so Botox was developed for human use by an ophthalmologist named Alan Scott, who is really the godfather of all this. He first received what would become Botox from Ed Chance at the University of Wisconsin. And he started to inject it in chimpanzees in the early 80s, and then moved on to human beings around the mid-80s, and it was approved for ophthalmologic uses in 88. In 1991, I was chatting with an ophthalmologist, Dr. Richard Listman, in New York, and I was still a fellow at Manhattan Eye, Ear, Throat, and we're just chatting about what was new in each other's specialties. And Richard says, "Have you ever heard about this botulism stuff that you can inject?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, it relaxes or weakens muscles where you inject it." And I said, "Well, how long does it last?" And I thought he was going to say like 24 or 48 or 72 hours. And he said, "Oh, about 3 months." And the next thing I said was, "Well, what about the corrugators in the frown area, the forehead, the crow's feet lines?" And I think I waited about 20 seconds and said, "What about the neck cords?" But that's sort of how it started for me.
And how did the role of Botox develop and broaden over time?
Well, I first started, I was still in my training, my last year of training as a fellow. So I went to my program director. He said, it's okay, but, just to be sure, I want you to talk to the boss, who was then Tom Reese. Talked to Tom Reese for about an hour. He said, sounds good, but just to be safe, I'm going to retire this year. Talk to next year's chairman. Everyone wanted to cover themselves. And so I talked to him and he said, go ahead, but only after you read every word that's been published on this molecule with people. And there was no internet then, so I went to the librarian in the hospital. We used to have medical libraries in every hospital. And she requested these articles. I read them, and the first patients I started injecting were people who were going to have what's called a bicoronal brow lift, where they get an incision across the top of their head, and we surgically debulk the frowning and forehead muscles and occasionally the crow's feet muscles. So those patients made sense, and they were very happy with the treatment. And then within 1 year, I had injected every muscle in the face. So the four that I talked about are probably the four most commonly injected muscles. But I also thought, well, there's certain muscles in the face that hold things up and certain muscles that pull things down. And I thought that since I really thought that this treatment was going to catch on and become a big deal, I thought, I wonder if you were to relax mostly those muscles that pull things down, that maybe I could slow down the aging of people's faces over time. And I think that definitely happens from looking at people, over 30 years that I've been injecting.
What products joined the playing field after Botox, and what kind of impact did they have?
Well, it's interesting. Botox, of course, was the first, and for ophthalmologic reasons. And then they had their first cosmetic approval for the frown lines in 2002. And so Botox became sort of a very popular thing to do then, because once a company has a cosmetic approval, they can promote it for that reason. In other words, when I was doing it cosmetically, they did not have a formal approval, so the company could not promote it for those reasons, although docs could use it for those reasons. The next to come out was Dysport, which came out in 2006. And I think that each time a competitor to Botox has come out, it increases public awareness, and I think it grows the market a little bit. I think each time there's a launch, just due to the fact that people hear about it, more people end up doing it. And then after Dysport, the next to come along was Xeomin. And there are some scientific differences between all of these products, but I would say all of them behave very similarly. They're not identical, but they're not widely disparate, say, like fillers are. With fillers, sometimes there are fillers that are very soft and squishy, or say we'd want to use them in the lips. And there are fillers that are very firm and robust that maybe you would use along a jawline. With the botulinum products, they're all awfully similar. And then after Xeomin came Jeuveau, and then the next one to come along was Daxxify. And you're right. When people are given a survey, and first of all, I just want to say, of all the treatments that plastic surgeons do to people, Botox is the most common. And I would say it also has the highest satisfaction, which is interesting. People like it. It works well, and they like how it works. However, if you were to ask them in a survey, what would they want? Typically, the number one answer is a longer duration. And Daxxify is formulated a little bit differently than the other products. And I believe that it's that formulation that helps it to be a durable, long-lasting botulinum product.
So, the important point, I think, exactly as you said, Dr. Kane, is that all of the products leading up to Daxxify, they're all botulinum toxin A. They, by and large, have the same components in different proportions, with the exception of Xeamin, which is only the core molecule. But the performance is similar. The indications are similar. The clinical experience that patients have had in huge numbers, millions a year, are similar. But it's a good point that, as new products come, it draws more attention to the field. For a long period of time, Botox was the only product. And so adding new products, even ones that are similar, has a price moderating effect on the marketplace, which is something patients appreciate. It's harder to raise the price if you have competitors than if you're the only player. So I think patients probably have benefited in that way, if nothing else. But we're really at a different point now.
Yes, I agree completely with that. I'm a huge fan of competition, and I think that when it comes to pharmaceuticals, if there are a lot of competitors, I think patients win. That's something that is good for patients. That said, when you try to compare them, sometimes patients will ask you, well, which one is the best one? Well, you would have to define best. I mean, these products before Daxxify are all very similar. It's sort of like, which is better, Coke or Pepsi? There's a lot of that is a very personal thing. And I do think that, if someone is good at doing this, if someone is good at reading faces, deciding which muscles to relax and how much, I believe that you could use any of these products and make people really happy. And when you look at the products, they have to reveal their data to get FDA approved. And when you look at the data, not only are they very similar in how they work, but they're also very similar as far as patient satisfaction.
And, the other thing that's really great about these products is the level of quality control, because the amount of the actual material is teeny. And the quality control to get the dosing so perfect, treatment after treatment after treatment, is really a triumph of pharmaceutical manufacturing. Because you have to say the quality control on all of these products is really outstanding, the ones we have in the United States.
I couldn't agree more. When you talk to people and you get into the botulinum science, there's a saying that the process is the product. I mean, all of these products are derived from a bacteria. To be clear, there's no bacteria that's being injected. It's just the protein that is very purified that the bacteria would make. And so every company has their own process, and every company has their own proprietary units. Patients sometimes tell you, I get so and so units of this product and so many units of a different product. And those units, there's no international standard of units for botulinum. Those units are proprietary to each company. And so you can't really compare products unit to unit as you might think you could.
So earlier we touched upon this briefly, and Dr. Bass, Dr. Kane, both of you have alluded to it. But Dr. Kane, can you bring us up to speed on this new development? What is Daxxify? What is its history, and how is it different from other neuromodulators that are already on the market?
Well, its history is interesting, and I guess full disclosure here, I've been working on this project for that company for 17 years. So it's been a long road. But to be fair, I've been working for Allergan, which makes Botox, for 25 years. And at one time or another, I was a consultant speaker or investigator for all of the products. So Daxxify is very different, and its history is different. And its history sort of reveals how it is different today. Originally, this product was designed to be the quote unquote Botox without needles. So we all know that, there are certain, almost everyone would like to look better if given that yes or no option, but only a certain amount of people do cosmetic plastic surgery every year. And then a certain amount of people are willing to get injections every year. But when you look at how many people are willing to put a goo of some kind on their skin and look better, well, that's almost everybody. And so it was designed to draw botulinum, which is a very big molecule. And that's one of the things about getting products through the skin. Large molecules don't get through the skin very well. Tiny molecules get through the skin more readily. And so there was a peptide in with the botulinum that is different. This peptide is not in any of the other formulations. And this peptide was designed to help pull botulinum through the skin. Now, as you can imagine, that was a very difficult road. And I was an investigator in phase 2, and we were in phase 3. And then that topical program was shelved. And when it was shelved, the company turned towards getting an injectable product to the market. However, they injected the product with that same peptide that helped to draw it through the skin. And so that was something that makes this product, different than all the other products. And that peptide is an excipient. And just for the audience, all of these botulinum products have excipients, and very commonly they're human serum albumin or salt or a little sugar. And the excipients have a role. The excipients stop the drug from sticking to the glass vial that they're in. They stop the drug from clumping too much together, because if, as Dr. Bass was saying, the quality control of these products is astounding. For a matter of example, 40 units of Daxxify and 20 units of Botox both contain 0.18 nanograms of the core neurotoxin. So that's an incredibly small amount, and it's just bizarre that they lined up like that. So the quality control is tremendous. But then again, if you didn't have these excipients in the vial, a certain percentage of the drug would stick to the vial side. So then how could you be sure how much you were injecting into the patient? So that's why excipients are there. The different excipient in Daxxify was originally there to help pull this big molecule through the skin. But how I think it works, and this is me, and I've said this at an academic meeting many years ago. In fact, most large biologic molecules, like, say, botulinum, like insulin, are negatively charged. Where this stuff works is at the end of the nerve terminal. For a muscle to move, it needs a signal. The nerve has to tell the muscle to move. So that's where Botox and its competitors work. They work on that nerve terminal, and they stop it from signaling the muscle to work at full strength. Now, the different peptide excipient in Daxxify is mostly positively charged. So we all know negatives attract. It's sort of like magnets when you're a little kid, or you can think of it as Velcro. So since the peptide is positively charged, the botulinum tends to stick to it, which is negatively charged. That terminal nerve membrane is also slightly negatively charged. So I think that maybe it's that peptide excipient that sort of helps the botulinum working part stick to the cell membrane, which is its target. So I think more of it stays where you want it to be rather than perhaps drifting around. And that's the difference in the formulation between Daxxify and the other products.
So as I mentioned earlier, the FDA labeling shows a longer duration. Can you tell us some of the specifics of what the study data shows about duration with Daxxify?
Absolutely. So since this was a long road to get here. Daxxify has been studied extensively in their clinical trials. The numbers of patients approach 4,000, which is a very large number. And when you look at them, there's a way to assess how long a drug lasts. And I'm not going to get into a lecture on biostatistics. I don't think the audience would find that very exciting, right? But you can do something and create what are called Kaplan-Meier curves. And what that does, it looks at the time point when about half of the patients still have a noticeable effect of the product and half of them have lost it. And that time point for Daxxify is right about 6 months. And for the other products, it's closer to about 3.5 or 4 months. And it's interesting. I'm always careful what I say. And sometimes for years that people call things longer or better. And, at least in the certified medical education world, if you're going to make a comparative statement, a direct comparative statement like that, you've got to have true data. And so this goes a little bit back to the history of Daxxify. As it was being taken along that long pathway to approval, in the FDA process, there are 3 phases, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. In the middle of phase 2, in phase 2B to be exact, there's always a dose ranging study where you've got a drug and you think it works, and the FDA wants to see how it works at different doses. So they did Daxxify at 20 units, 40 units, and 60 units. And at that point, all drug companies are really focused on getting an approval of the drug. And I have to give a shout out. At that time, the CEO, Dan Brown, did something incredibly bold that I've never seen another company in this space do. When he was doing his dose ranging study for his own drug, he included an arm that had 20 units of Botox in there, or 20 units of botulinum, which is the non-brand name, same thing. And he found that the data showed that 40 units of Daxxify lasted statistically significantly longer than 20 of Botox. And that label dose of 20 of Botox had been the gold standard in the industry for, over 20 years. So that was a big deal.
Just again to bring up the points that you raised. So you said there has to be data. So this is what that means is you can't look at a study of Botox and a different study in a different group of patients of a different product and kind of glue them together. You have to do a study that treats some people with one product and the other in the same study to be able to make that conclusion. So that extra durability again is what everybody hears from their patients. I love my Botox, but how can I get it to last longer so I don't have to get injected quite as often? So this looked like this might be the way. The other point I want to make is that 40 Daxxify units is not the same as 40 Botox units. In other words, units for each of the products are unique to that product. And you mentioned the weight of the core molecule, the 0.01, et cetera, nanograms, which is 0.01 billionths of a gram, just so people understand. So it's an equivalent weight of the core molecule, but the numbers of the units, it doesn't mean that the Daxxify dose was higher, because the units for Daxxify and the units for Botox are different.
Exactly. And it's sort of strange how we measure drugs, right? For instance, botulinum preparations have been measured in units since they've been on the market. Another drug like that is insulin. So, why would you measure a drug in units versus weight? Well, of course, early on, units tend to measure the activity of a drug versus just the weight of a drug. And so obviously with insulin and botulinum, you certainly didn't want too much drug. In other words, you'd be better off putting too little as opposed to too much, although getting it just about right would be ideal. And so they started out being measured in units, but now, there are 4 products on the market. I work with a lot of different companies. I'm currently working with 2 companies that have 2 products that are coming soon to the market. So there are about to be 6. And they all have different units. The units are proprietary. Each company has their own way to measure units. And so that makes it confusing. And so, when we give antibiotics to people, there are 2 ways we could measure it. Well, how do we measure it? We measure it by weight. You give 250 milligrams of amoxicillin or 500 milligrams of ciprofloxacin, and that's what we're used to. You could certainly plate out bacteria on an agar petri dish and put some antibiotic on it and see how many bacteria it killed, but that's not what we do. We do everything else by weight. And so when units are so different and they lack a comparison, if you really want to try to compare things, it sort of makes sense to compare them by the weight of the active core working part of the botulinum formulation.
So, we talked a little bit about durability with Daxxify in their comparison study, but there's always another side to the story. So what can you tell me about durability with other neuromodulators and where that could be going?
Sure. Well, first let's define some terms. The other neuromodulators have a labeled dose, and let's start with the most simple area, which is the frown lines between the eyebrows. That is typically, and as far as I know, always when one of these products comes to market, that's the indication that they go for. That's sort of the gold standard. So for Botox, it's 20 units. For Dysport, it's 50 Spaywood or Dysport units. For Xeomin, it's 20. And for Jeuveau, it's 20. And for Daxxify, it's 40. So those numbers are different, and that's what the company can promote, teach other docs how to use, and advertise. However, in the sort of forever quest to increase longevity, some people, including a friend of ours, John Joseph, started looking at these other botulinum products and seeing, well, if I injected 2 or 2.5 times as much, could I get them to last longer? And you can. You can get them to last a little bit longer just by sort of overloading, by definition, the nerve with more and more botulinum products. So that is another way to push up the duration. But then again, you're putting a lot more drug in the person too. There are pros and cons to everything that you look at.
So we see that by redosing some of the existing medications, we may move in the direction of the performance that's been shown with Daxxify. The worry with high doses, particularly in that frowner area that you mentioned, is eyelid ptosis. Now, I know you have thought process about how eyelid ptosis forms and whether that's a problem of injecting too much dose in this area. But how are people trying to avoid more ptosis by going to a higher dose, or are they seeing more ptosis, yes or no? And what technique are they using to try to avoid that?
So that is a great question, because everything that we're just talking about, increasing the dose, sounds really good. Wow, I can take this product I've been using for a long time, just put more in, and it's going to last longer. Well, there are a few caveats there. One, I would say the people that have done these studies, like John Joseph and Corey Maas, and there are a few others, Martina, uh, are expert injectors. And so they take a relatively large amount of botulinum and inject it, and it better be a really exacting injection. Now, when they have done those studies, they did not notice an increased risk of eyelid ptosis or droopy eyelids. However, I speak at a lot of meetings around the world. And so last summer, there's one of these large meetings in London, the FACE meeting. It's held every year, and it's usually about 2,000 people go to that meeting. And I was on a panel talking about increasing the longevity of botulinum injections. And some of it was about Daxxify, but some of it was also injecting patients at a regular interval. If you can stop that muscle from coming back full strength, their apparent improvement tends to last longer and longer. Also on the panel, there were people talking about what we call high dose injection, what we were just talking about. And so since it was a panel, we asked the room, and there are over 1,000 injectors of botulinum in the room. And we said, how many of you? And I said, didn't just do it once or twice, or didn't do it to try it out. And I'm not saying you do it half the time, but how many of you, as a routine part of your practice of medicine, use a high dose to inject these people? And one or two people raised their hand in a room over 1,000 people. So then the next question was, why? Or why did so few people adopt it? And the number one reason was, frankly, what you were just alluding to, is that they were afraid. They were afraid of putting this high dose of botulinum in one spot in a patient, that it would drift and they would have, as you mentioned, eyelid ptosis or brow ptosis, or getting botulinum in areas they didn't want. That was the number one fear. The second reason was economic. Because there are different ways to charge when you're injecting these products. Some people charge per unit, some people charge per area. I've always been a per area person, but if you were charging per unit, how are you going to have that conversation with the patient? Well, this injection, I'm going to charge you 2.5 times as much, and I think it'll last maybe like a month longer than normal. That's not a very good proposition for most patients, I would think. And the audience didn't bring it up, but the third thing I would add is, now after COVID and in COVID still, everyone's sort of up on vaccines. Well, botulinum is a foreign protein. And if you increase the dose and inject people closely together, a small percentage of people start to become immune or non-responders to botulinum. Now, currently, that's a very small percentage in the aesthetic or cosmetic world, where doses tend to not be very high. However, that number isn't zero. And maybe if you're putting, 2.5 times the protein load in people regularly, you would start to see more non-response. Again, that longitudinal study has not been done. I'm just sort of pontificating here and extrapolating to one of the issues if it were done.
Yeah, those are all important points. Now, one of the ways that I've heard people are trying to avoid spread of effect, unwanted effects far afield of where you're targeting with higher doses, is by using a very concentrated reconstitution instead of a typical or more dilute reconstitution. And in fact, Daxxify reconstitutes in a much smaller volume than what the other products do. So is that part of the solution to using other toxins, other neuromodulators in high dose, or it's not enough of a difference to protect you from unwanted spread?
No, I think you're hitting the nail on the head there. When you look at the studies of high dose botulinum, they made their concentrations higher. So in other words, they put less saline in so that what they were injecting was more concentrated because they're worried about spread, right? They're worried about clinical spread of this molecule into other muscles that you don't want to hit. You know, one of those things I've said 1,000 or 10,000 times from the podium was, forget about all these recipes and rules. The whole game is how many units do you want to stick where? And that's it. So what they're doing is concentrating it so they're not getting it stuck to muscles in the area that they don't want to affect. And that's what you would have to do. And one thing I would say, when you look at the label and you look at the reconstitution volumes, yes, at the recommended reconstitution, Daxxify is more concentrated, but if you think that their label dose is 40 units versus 20 for all the other formulations except one, actually the push volumes that if you were to inject the glabella, those volumes are about the same. They are the same. So it's a yes and no, and then it gets into the discussion of spread and diffusion, which are different things. Spread is, the motion of the botulinum into areas around the target. Diffusion is just part of spread. Spread has many variables. Diffusion is almost just like the Brownian motion of molecules, and by definition, goes from higher concentration to lower concentration. So it's interesting when people make mistakes from the podium all the time, and sometimes they'll say, well, I'm using a higher dose and it's more concentrated to decrease my diffusion. Well, actually, that's exactly the opposite. If you have a higher concentration, you're increasing diffusion by definition, but what they're really trying to do is decrease spread.
So really, there's a lot of complexity here, and it's both a technically challenging issue to know if there's another pathway with the older neuromodulators to greater longevity, and there's going to just need to be a practical clinical dimension in figuring out the actual performance of Daxxify, not in a clinical study with very experienced injectors, but in the clinical marketplace with regular injectors.
I could not agree more. In fact, I've been very involved with the launch of all the other products. And part of the launch is you speak to people in the lay press, and they would say, well, what's the difference? How is it different? And with the other products, there really wasn't very much to say that would say get a writer or editor or the people reading the article very excited. But one thing that everyone says they want is something that lasts longer. Now, will this shake out in the real world? Well, time will tell, right? Sometimes people say things, but they always end up voting with their feet in their wallet, as they say. And we have to see how they work. Certainly, there are some things where it's obvious, like like you, I have a fair number of people who fly in to be injected by me. Well, if you're flying in from somewhere else and something lasts a little bit longer, well, that kind of makes sense. If it's someone right around the corner who actually sort of likes coming to the office, well, maybe that's not for them, but maybe it is. And it's not just the duration, remember, but it's also the convenience. They can avoid an office visit. And when you inject people with botulinum, most people do not get bruised, but the risk of a bruise is never zero. So if you're decreasing the amount of injections over time, you're probably decreasing their risk of a bruise as well. So there are advantages each way.
So let me get you to look in the crystal ball and tell me your best sense. Is this going to be a big change in what most patients are using, or will this just end up being some slice of the neuromodulator market? What do you think is going to happen? How will the introduction of Daxxify disrupt the existing neuromodulator marketplace?
Well, that is always something that's tough to predict, but I do think it will definitely take a slice, but I don't think it will be a small slice. People want duration. That's what they say. I think that this will appeal to people. Plus, we know that, why do people not get it? Well, let's go historically. About 20 to 30 years ago, the number one reason for people not getting Botox, that was the only drug around then, was that they were afraid that it would do something bad to their health. Well, after decades of millions of people getting it a year, that sort of faded away. And then the next fear, or let's say threshold is a better word, would be, well, I see people on the Oscars and different award shows and they look like statues. They look terrible. And I think now most patients realize that's not the drug's fault. That's the fault of the person on the other end of the needle, right? And I'm not meaning the patient.
Yeah, not bad Botox, bad injector.
Exactly. These things are just tools. And like any tool, you can use it well or use it poorly. And now, why are some people not getting it? Well, some people think, well, this idea of having to go in every 3 or 4 months doesn't appeal to me. And they seem to think something bad would happen if they didn't keep up with it. And I would say nothing bad happens. There's no rebound negativity from not doing it, but it sort of sounds easier if you can say, well, this stuff really works pretty well for 6 months. Well, maybe coming in every 6 or 8 months or so, that may be more appealing and may get more people to do it. But people, it's interesting. I do this thought experiment, and I want to be clear. Thought experiments are not data, right? We're just talking about data. And so just imagine if things were backwards. And, whenever there's an established product, it's established for a reason. People like it and it works well and it works well for them. And there's a little comfort there and they tend to stick with it. But just imagine if instead of being the fourth product out, Daxxify was the first. And so you've got people, and everyone's used to coming back every 6 or 7 or 8 months. Not everyone comes back right when it starts to wear off. Very often they let it go for a while. And then you had a product that worked for 3 or 4 months. And how would you get patients eager to try that? That's a different thing, isn't it? That would be a very tough proposition. That said, people like their products that they're on. I'm sure you have patients that are, diehard Dysport patients or Jeuveau or Xeomin patients. And I have many, many, many diehard Botox patients. They love it and sort of wouldn't want to try anything else. So it's a complex issue. what you mentioned, and that's my best answer for it.
Yeah, I think I made the point earlier, and I'll say it again, that clinical study performance is not clinical marketplace performance. So we'll have to wait and see in the average injector's hands what kind of performance the product takes. If it matches what the clinical study says, there's at least a compelling reason, this is a different product with different performance according to the FDA label. But separate from that, patients are very attached to their products. And what I usually have said to patients with new neuromodulator introduction before Daxxify was, listen, if you're getting what you want out of whichever product it is you're using, stick with it. If there's something about what you're getting that's not ideal in your view, then because it's a recurrent treatment, maybe next time you try the new product or a different product and see if that works better for you. And if it does, you've got a new favorite product. And if it doesn't, you go back to the product you were using previously. And, a portion of patients, relatively small portion typically in my practice, will tinker. And a lot of them land up back on the original product, but some of them decide they like the new product better. Here again, there's a little more of a compelling reason, but when we get to the takeaways, I'm going to do a thought experiment, which, like you said, is not data, but I'm going to do a thought experiment about if the product performs this way or it performs this way, not in a population, but for you as an individual, how are you going to feel about switching?
Definitely. A lot of factors at play here, and I think only time will tell how this will all play out. So, Dr. Kane, can you give us a teaser as to what else might be coming in the future? What's in the pipeline?
Sure. I think the next two products that will probably, and again, with a big caveat, it's handicapping the FDA in the approval process is a sort of a crystal ball sort of thing. It's hard to do, but I think probably the next two products that would come here would be Letybo, that's the brand name overseas, or botulinum toxin, and botulinum toxin. Letybo is a toxin from Hugel, made in Korea, which is sort of the botulinum powerhouse place of the world where many products are manufactured, and botulinum, which would be a Galderma product, and it's commonly called the liquid toxin. So it would be the first formulation that we don't reconstitute in a vial with just a little dust at the bottom, a little solid dust. It already comes as a liquid formulation in the vial. And so those I think are the next two that are going to come. And what will be interesting and as Dr. Bass, as you said, I have a bone to pick with people from the podium that compare numbers from one study to a completely different study where there's a different patient population, different injectors, and sometimes different scales are used. That's not good science, but I am curious to see what their duration and their patient satisfaction will be, as with everything. And as you just mentioned, how sometimes patients try another product and then they go back to their original. Sometimes they stick with another product. Having more and more choices and competition, I think, is something that always benefits the patient, which at the end of the day is the number one goal, or should be the number one goal of everyone.
And lastly, before we wrap up, Dr. Bass, what should our listeners take away from today's episode?
So I think we have to look at first the question, why is neuromodulator the most popular treatment? It hands down is the most frequently performed, in other words, the largest numbers. And as Dr. Kane said, the satisfaction level is sky high compared to any other aesthetic treatment. So there's something about what neuromodulators do, the way it makes us look, that people find extremely pleasing. So that means that given that popularity, we're certain to have more options, more indications, more products. So this is an area that's just going to continue to grow because the performance is so extraordinarily good. In terms of the new product, I said I was going to do a thought experiment, and I think how it fares is likely going to result from a price versus duration, and we didn't talk a lot about price of the new product. With Daxxify, if you were getting 4 months from your Botox and now you get 6 months or 7 months or 8 months from Daxxify, because a portion of the patients get effects that long and even up to 9 months, although that proportion is low, there may be a very good value proposition there. But if you're getting, a good 4 or 5 months out of your Botox and you get 6 months out of Daxxify or 6.5 months, and you paid 1.5 times or you paid twice what you paid for the Botox treatment, you may decide there's not a good value proposition there. And I don't think we know the answer to that because the clinical studies don't look at that pricing factor in patient behavior because nobody in the clinical study is paying for the treatment. So I think we're going to have to wait and see on how that plays out. But there is the convenience factor. And Dr. Kane pointed out, particularly for people who are traveling, people with a busy schedule, or people prone to bruising, or people that really just don't like getting poked with needles, that if you get injected less often, you have less trips to the doctor's office and less risk of getting a bruise. So I think we'll see, the public will, as Dr. Kane said, vote with their feet.
Dr. Kane, would you like to add any takeaways?
That sounds exactly perfect what Dr. Bass said. We can sit here and again, it's one of the things I say from the podium all the time. I can show you all sorts of graphs and dose response curves and how things work. But at the end of the day, it's difficult to guess in advance how patients will like each product. And you break up patients into two groups of people. How new patients would like each new product, and how patients already using another product that are satisfied with it, how they would treat a new product. And that's a very difficult thing to predict. So what we can do is talk about the science of products, talk about the studies that show tremendous satisfaction with the product, but the final determiners of how these products go are the patients, which is how it should be.
Thank you, Dr. Kane and Dr. Bass, for sharing your insight and expertise on this exciting new development in aesthetic medicine.
And I'd like to thank Dr. Kane for joining us and really sharing his wealth of expertise over decades working in this particular arena of aesthetic medicine. We were very fortunate to be able to get him to join us and share his perspectives. So, Dr. Kane, thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. All I can say is that it was an absolute pleasure to be here with both of you today.
Thank you for listening to the Park Avenue Plastic Surgery Class podcast. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, write a review, and share the show with your friends. Be sure to join us next time to avoid missing all the great content that's coming your way. If you want to contact us with comments or questions, we'd love to hear from you. Send us an email at podcast@drbass.net or DM us on Instagram @drbassnyc.